Thank you for joining us, everybody. My name is David Hewitt. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the Community Science and Chapter Engagement AmeriCorps member serving with Audubon, Vermont. Welcome to Audubon, Vermont's youth-led webinar series, Tough Conversations. Tonight, we're talking about the buzz on responsible beekeeping, a topic of growing importance as Vermont just reached an all-time high of honeybee colonies in 2023. We'll explore the benefits of backyard beekeeping as well as some of the threats they can pose if not managed properly. We're thrilled to have local panelists sharing their expertise with us. We're joined by Dr. Samantha Alger, who is a research assistant professor in Plant and Soil Science Department at UVM. At UVM, she conducts research on bee disease, teaches intro beekeeping courses, and directs the Vermont Bee Lab, a lab that offers disease diagnostic services for Vermont beekeepers. We are also joined by Brooke Decker, who is a pollinator health specialist and state apiculturist, with the Vermont Department of Agriculture, Food, and Market. She is also the current vice president of the Apiary Inspectors of America. And we are also joined by Curtis Mraz, a fourth-generation beekeeper and farmer at Champlain Valley Apiaries. His family's over 90-year-old honey and beekeeping business is located in Middlebury. He is passionate about inspiring grassroots action and change, especially within our food system. And finally, we are joined by Fred Putnam Jr., who is a member of the Vermont Beekeepers Association Board of Directors. He also leads the Addison County Beekeepers Association. And with the VBA and the ACBA, he conducts a number of educational workshops for beekeepers each year. We will have a Q&A period at the end of the panel discussion, so please enter your questions using the chat or the Q&A feature as they come up. Audubon Vermont Policy Intern Allison will be monitoring and compiling questions throughout the webinar. This webinar will also be recorded and uploaded to the Audubon Vermont YouTube channel. Please also consider donating directly to our panelists for their shared expertise or to their organizations to support their important work. We will share these links in the chat as well as in a follow-up email after the webinar's conclusion. And with that, I'll pass it to Kira to ask our panelists some questions.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kira Monsom. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Education and Outreach AmeriCorps member here at Audubon, Vermont. I'm really excited to be with you all today and get to know a little bit about what you do. So I'd love for us to go around and learn a bit more about our panelists, starting with Curtis. Could you please share your name, pronouns, and either your favorite bee story or your favorite bee fun fact?
Yeah, so my name is Curtis Mraz. Favorite bee fun fact. Oh, I use he, him, his pronouns. Probably that it takes over 2 million flower blossoms to make 1 pound of honey. And sorry for everyone else, I took the easy one.
Awesome. All right, we can move to Sam.
Hey everyone, Samantha Alger, also go by Sam, she, her pronouns. And I think maybe to give us a little background around one of the reasons why we're meeting today. So the honeybee, the European or Western honeybee, Apis mellifera, is an introduced non-native species of bee. And a large proportion of the hives in Vermont are migratory, meaning that they spend most of their lives outside of the state.
Very cool. Thank you. Okay, Fred.
Yeah, Fred name is Fred Putnam, pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm with the Vermont Beekeepers Association, as David mentioned, but I also run a beekeeping business here in Brandon. I had a similar fun fact as Curtis, except when I sell a quart of honey, I try to stay grounded in what that really means and how much work is really involved in that, and it's actually 5.5 million visits to flowers to produce that quart of honey. You know, it's a huge amount of work. But also a little story I was giving a presentation on beekeeping at the Orwell Library, and there were quite a few people there that day, including this young girl who was about a 4th or 5th grader sitting in the front row. And I went through my whole spiel. It was, I don't know, half an hour or 45 minutes or something like that. with all sorts of little videos and all. And then we got close to the end and the little girl pipes up, okay, when is the activity now? And she was looking at the back of the room where we had honey tasting samples. She was anxious to get to the honey. She didn't care about what I was saying. But anyway, other people were interested.
Yeah, she's there for the sweet stuff for sure.
Exactly. She liked the honey.
All right, and Brooke.
Yeah, so good segue to my story. Oh, so I better start with my name. My name is Brooke Decker, she, her pronouns. My favorite bee story is I like to spend time in the desert when I have a chance to get away. And I was exploring a crater in the desert southwest, and there's honeybees all over the place out there, wild. They have to be wild there. And so anyway, we found some wild honeybee comb and a cliff, and dangerously tried to spear it down and got stung all up. But that little ounce of honey was so worth it to get a taste of the desert. Like Fred was saying, it's a lot of hard work, and it's fun to taste something like from a whole different environment.
Awesome. All right, thank you. So we can go in that order or kind of bounce around, however you guys would like to do this. Our next question is, tell us about your organization. What is its mission? How does the organization generally advance that mission? And what is your job/role?
Yeah, I can start. Champlain Valley Apiaries. We're Vermont's oldest honey company. We've been here since 1931. And our mission has remained relatively the same throughout that time period. But it's to produce the highest quality honey and to promote the importance of honeybees and sustainable agriculture. And that used to be like really easy to do. I think beekeeping kind of came naturally to a lot of people, and keeping bees alive in the 30s and 40s and 50s in Vermont was a much different story than it is now. And so in large part, that mission has become us trying to keep our bees alive. We're really in an uphill battle and have been for the last decade or more, facing a number of different pressures, but primarily pesticides is what we're experiencing and seeing.
I guess I'm next, eh? So I'm with the Vermont Beekeepers Association, and the Vermont Beekeepers Association has been around since 1886, which is a whole lot longer than I've been with them. But the short on what its mission is that we're in the business to support beekeepers to be successful and beekeeping, and that the health of honeybee colonies across the state. And to that extent, we put on quite a few workshops to members and non-members in some cases throughout the year. This year thus far we have 24 workshops either in person or Zoom sessions scheduled for the year, and there will be more added before the year is out. And these workshops are for anywhere from people who, in 3 weeks, we have one for people who don't even have bees yet, prospective beekeepers. And then we have others that are for at a more intermediate level that are looking for additional knowledge, like how to raise queens and advanced ways of wintering and so forth. So we have a number of workshops scheduled. And the primary goal of those workshops is to take away, we face the pesticide issue and a number of other things. But we're trying to help new beekeepers learn the mechanics of what they need to do to take away that part of the potential loss of honeybee colonies. In other words, learn what they need to do so they know what to do to keep their honeybee healthy colonies, honeybee colonies healthy, sorry. So that's pretty much what we're up to, educational goal. And my role is I teach a number of those workshops throughout the year and help co-host some of the others.
Great, thank you.
I think I might have put us out of order here, but I'm a research professor at UVM. I run the Vermont Bee Lab. The Bee Lab is dedicated to the health of both managed and wild bees through research, education, and outreach, although we've really been taking on a lot more managed bee projects as of late. We have a diagnostic lab where we process honeybee samples from beekeepers for free, and they send them in for results on pests and pathogens to make management decisions. We have various research projects, one of which is working with honeybee breeders and producers, where we're leveraging the capabilities of the Bee Lab to support their breeding programs to select for more disease-resistant bees. And we also run a pesticide monitoring project.
Thank you, Sam. And Brooke.
All right, I work for the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, and its mission is to facilitate, support, and encourage the growth and viability of agriculture in Vermont while protecting the working landscape, human health, animal health, plant health, consumers, and the environment. And so my role there, my official title is Pollinator Health Specialist. I'm primarily the bee inspector or apiculturalist. And so my role basically is anything having to do with honeybees. I administer the apiary program, so the regulatory side of that, as well as a lot of education and outreach through that program as well. I do a lot of education on pollinator protection with for pesticide applicators, and do basically anything that comes up that has to do with bees gets sent my way in the agency. Yeah, I think that's good for now.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, we will hop right into some of our content questions. So, what are the benefits of someone taking up backyard beekeeping?
Is this popcorn, or are we going around in the same order?
We can start with Curtis
I think
again.
popcorn's fun, but
Yeah.
I'm happy to start. And Fred might have more to say on this in general, given what he does. You know, I'm a commercial beekeeper, which is much different than what Fred's doing, which is, you know, hands-on education with a lot of people. And in my opinion, the importance of people wanting to become beekeepers or learning more about beekeeping is an awareness and education about what's going on with bees. It's less important for people to actually beekeep, in my opinion, because there's sometimes with more beekeepers, there becomes more problems and more spread of disease and less awareness of what's actually happening in the hive. But with an interest in beekeeping, people are looking in Fred's hives, or they're looking in Fred's friends' hives, and they're generally having more engagement with bees, and building, you know, a relationship with them in which they're going to care and act out when we have big issues like pesticides and climate change and lack of forage kind of affecting our bees.
So from my standpoint, thinking back to when I first started keeping bees, number one, it's a huge learning curve and there's a lot to learn. And I'm very grateful for people like Chaz Mraz, Curtis's dad, Bill Mraz's grandfather, and other big time beekeepers across the state for spending the time to teach new beekeepers how to keep bees successfully. And that's kind of what I do now. But in the beginning, what really is great about this business is when you successfully get honey, which doesn't always happen, and also when you successfully overwinter that first bee colony. In other words, your colony goes through the summer and then they make it through the winter, and it's like the sense of satisfaction is just unbelievable. So if you're a new beekeeper, on the other hand, sometimes, you know, there's a huge amount of work to this, and we'll probably get into that a little bit later. It's not just a simple thing to do, as Curtis talked about earlier. There's a lot to learn, and a lot of ways that you can lose your colonies. But in some cases, it's good to think about maybe not being a beekeeper, but creating habitat that helps beekeepers, like Curtis just mentioned, honeybee forage, you know, grow some plants that create forage. But so that way may be the way that you can most successfully help bees and other honeybees and other pollinators, is not necessarily by becoming a beekeeper, although that can be a lot of fun too, but also by doing things that helps the pollinators.
Awesome, thank you.
So I think of honeybees as sort of being like a gateway bee or a gateway insect, in that beekeeping can really bring someone an appreciation of all insects and other native bees and the environment. And by beekeeping, you're learning a lot about the phenology or the timing of flowering plants and interactions between pollinators and plants, which is just incredibly rewarding and interesting. And of course, you know, it's a hobby, so you get a benefits of learning a really fascinating hobby. And like obviously the honey and the wax could be a benefit if you're a hobbyist beekeeper, taking up backyard beekeeping.
Yeah, and I'll echo a lot what Samantha said more eloquently than I was going to. But the backyard beekeeping, I know, and you know, I've always loved honey, and so everywhere I've gone throughout my life, I've sought out beekeepers to get honey, basically, and then learned through time how to keep bees. And so I remember first learning how to keep bees as a young child, and just learning insect ecology is really different than, you know, having other kind of hobbies. So learning that is really really empowering in a lot of ways. And like Fred said, like beekeeping has a steep learning curve. So once you make it through the first few years of colonies dying from mistakes, then you really, you know, can get to the next level and really understand kind of the insect biology of a superorganism like honeybees. And it also, like Samantha said, really has helped me, and I think others too. Once you know, start looking at what honeybees are foraging on, you start learning flowers, you start understanding the seasons more, understanding weather patterns more. And so it's a really good way to read the environment, and also have very rewarding benefits.
Wonderful, thank you. We touched on this a little bit in this question with some of our answers, but our next question is, what are the potential negative effects of beekeeping, and how might those effects be mitigated and avoided? Whoever would like to start is fine.
So, I mean, one example is recently the Vermont Agency of Ag published an article or report saying that, you know, we have more bees now in Vermont than we've ever had in the recorded history of the state. And I think a lot of people's initial reaction is to like celebrate that and be excited because like more bees, isn't that more marvelous? But the reality is no. And the reason that is because a lot of these bees, 17,000 that are in the state of Vermont, are coming from other states. And in large part, that's because we can't keep bees alive in Vermont like we used to. And so we need to import bees from Georgia or from South Carolina, where they have less harsh winters and they can survive easier, or the pesticide pressure is different than it is here. And so, you know, I just say, like, if a lot of people are thinking about becoming backyard beekeepers or engaging in this, that ultimately is going to mean more bees. And is more bees necessarily a good thing? Is that an indication of a healthy and robust bee industry? Probably not.
I want to add to that a little bit. I think it's really important for any new beekeeper to realize that there's a significant time commitment required to learn how to do it. It's not just something where you can stick a hive or a colony in the backyard and then go pick honey out of it, get some honey out of it a 3 months later. It's not that simple. You know, Curtis talked about the survival rate. If you take that tack, you've got just about 100% success that your colony is going to die. So there's a lot to learn, and you really have to be willing to take the time to learn in addition to managing the colony. And I think the downside is that a couple of downsides to not taking that time and not learning what needs to be done. One, you lose your colonies, which is almost a guarantee. Samantha talked about getting past that first, second, or third year and losing colonies at a high rate. That happens. But it especially happens to people who don't take the time to learn what they need to do. So that time commitment is really necessary. The other thing is that we know that viruses are transmitted from honeybees to some of the native pollinators. What's not clear, and maybe Samantha can address this a little bit, is how much of an impact that really is. But we do know that that there are some health effects for honeybee colonies near you if you don't take care of your own colonies. You have to keep your colonies healthy, and the neighbor needs to keep their colonies healthy, and so on and so on, so that there's not an interchange of the kinds of things, viruses and bacteria that can decimate colonies. So you really have to be on your game in terms of learning and also on managing the health so that you're not impacting not only native populations potentially, but also particularly neighboring honeybee colonies.
So while beekeeping can be really amazing and beneficial for the person doing the beekeeping, honeybees in general are not beneficial to the health of native bees. There's been various studies finding competition between managed and native pollinators, and then as everyone else talked about, like the issue of disease spillover is a big one. And I spent some time studying disease spillover of RNA viruses between managed honeybees and wild bees, and find that managed honeybees are hotspots for viruses that can then spill over into managed bumblebee populations. And of particular concern is when honeybees are getting transported large distances as part of their migratory routes. They'll be put on the backs of flatbed trucks and moved into different crops throughout the season. And you got to understand that these bees are coming from all across the country and they're converging all together on flowers for a short period of time all together. And then they kind of move on to the next spot, bringing whatever pathogens they might have come in contact with while they were pollinating the crop with them. And so migratory bees in particular are problematic because of when they get imported back into the state, they could potentially bring all these various pathogens. I think of it as like sending your kid to daycare, them coming sick and then coming back home and getting you sick. It's easy to imagine how that might happen. And so, yeah, there are definitely ways that beekeeping can cause harm for the wild environment, like our native bees. But there are ways that we'll talk about later that beekeepers, things that beekeepers can do and that the beekeeping industry can do to help reduce these impacts.
Wonderful, thank you.
So something that comes up with in my job is I meet with beekeepers and they say I want to save the bees, and so they got a hive of bees, they bought a hive of bees, and it sits there in their yard, and they call me and say it died, and they say, why did it die? So I talk with them about the management and basically try to explain that to them that there's an analogy that a colleague of mine, Megan Milbrath, likes to use, that is keeping honeybees to save all pollinators is like keeping backyard chickens to save an endangered hermit thrush. So Audubon Society, you guys could probably relate to a bird metaphor, but so yeah, and I think Fred touched on it a lot. There's a lot of there's a huge steep learning curve, and I think when people take on backyard beekeeping, they either get all into it or really fall out of it because it takes pretty quickly, because it takes a lot of time and effort. And so it's like the people that seem to be very fascinated right off and like really dive into it, before you know it, they've got like 20 colonies, and and they're just like really passionate about it. So as far as the common mistakes, I think the common mistake is thinking that keeping honeybees is saving the world. They are livestock. They are part of the agriculture system. They are, a way to feed yourself some honey and your neighbor some honey, or if you get larger, feed, Vermont, some honey and have, wax for candles. But they are not, I would say, they aren't the answer to solving like the bees. There's so much hot topic about bees and their threats. And there was mention of a report that came out, and I encourage folks to read it because it does kind of spell out in numbers a lot of the stuff that has been mentioned here. I won't go into it because it's just very cut and dry and very clear there, just about the number of beekeepers in the state, and there are more colonies than ever. And I think that says that we have a robust beekeeping environment. And part of that is through the VBA encouraging beekeeping. Part of that is beekeeping operations realizing it's a viable farm business. So I think mistakes can certainly be made, and learning how to to get to that status of being a farmer that contributes to, you know, a larger scale system. But yeah, we'll just stop there, I guess.
Great, thank you, Brooke. Yes, and we'd be happy to send out the link to that report as well in our follow-up email. Our next question is, what have you seen in regards to Varroa mite mitigation efforts?
Okay,
Go ahead,
so I'm going to
Curtis.
talk about Varroa, and I'm going to talk about pesticides. And also the native bee issue, right? There's like these three topics, and we love to talk about Varroa, and we love to talk about native bees and how how honeybees are harming native bees. But what doesn't get talked about enough is pesticides. And oftentimes we use Varroa mite and we pin native bees and honeybees against each other to defer from what's maybe actually going on, right? Because honeybees have been in this state for a long, long, long time. And also native bees have been in this state for a long, long, long time. And both have like gone into drastic decline in the last 20 years. So like, what the heck is going on? Maybe it doesn't have to do with the Varroa mite, which, you know, has been around for 20 years, but we've also had tracheal mite that the honeybee has overcome. You know, we've had nosema, we've had American and European foul brood. And what's new to the scene in the last 20 years is neonicotinoid pesticides, which are used almost ubiquitously on corn and soybean seed throughout the state, primarily corn seed. Only a tiny percentage of that pesticide ends up in the plant tissue. Most of it leaches into the soil, into the waterways, into neighboring plants, which then it gets up into the nectar and the pollen. The bees feed on it, they bring it back. Their immune systems are drastically weakened. So vectors, disease vectors spread by Varroa mites can easily attack honeybees, which are then spread to native bees while they're in competition or visiting the same flowers. So like, we can deal with Varroa mite, we can deal with native bees and honeybees and that relationship, but can we really address the issue of either of them without dealing with the pesticides first?
Thank you, Curtis.
I'm just going to add a little bit to what Curtis said, but I'm not going to repeat what he said about the pesticide issue because it is one of those endemic things that affect us. So one of the things that we have to realize, and I think even a lot of beekeepers and researchers don't really realize this, is how incredibly sensitive insects are, and honeybees and other insects as well, bumblebees and other flying insects, are to very, very low levels of pesticide exposure. I mean, extremely low levels, down in the parts per billion, adversely affect honeybees and other bees to the point where they can't survive winter. They may not kill them outright, but it affects their reproduction rate, their dwindling rate, the rate at which they lose bees over time, to the point where they can't make it through winter. So that aside, I'll talk to your question directly about Varroa. Varroa is a parasite that ended up in this country back in the late 80s and quickly spread to the entire Western Hemisphere. It is, in terms of size, something that's about the size of your outstretched hand if you attach that to yourself in relation to the size of the honeybee. It's actually pretty large, very visible, and it attaches itself to the underside of the bees in the abdomen area and depletes the supplies of energy, the energy stores, and it has more physiological function than just providing energy, but they're called fat bodies, and it reduces the thing called vitellogenin, which is in the fat bodies that is critical to the physiological function of the bees. So there's been a lot of focus on controlling levels of Varroa mites, and we've had some success at that. There are other diseases like American foul brood, and I'm going to directly credit the existence of Brooke Decker's position for having a huge impact on the reduction of, in cases of, it's a bacterial disease that's deadly to honeybee colonies. Basically, you lose a colony if you have it. From however many we had 23 or so 2 or 3 years ago to 0 this year. That is a trajectory that happened because we have a pollinator health specialist, which we pushed for back in 2019. So we're starting to see we have some very positive impacts from that. But in terms of the Varroa, we focus on that, and most new beekeepers, it's a new thing. But for beekeepers who've been in it even 1 year, they already know how to measure, when to measure. Many of them know what to do to keep the population of Varroa under control, so that doesn't become the thing that causes you to lose your colonies. You know, as Curtis mentioned, they are a vector for some very deadly viruses that have become deadly over time, deadly to honeybees. And the only way that we have to mitigate that transmission of viruses is to keep the population of that parasite Varroa destructor under control. So we spent a lot of time teaching that. It's very well known in the beekeeping world now. We know a lot more about Varroa than we used to. And in terms of new beekeepers, it doesn't take very long for a new beekeeper to realize that that's a really critical basic function in beekeeping management to maintain that. So we take a very active role in directly answering your question, take a very active role in educating people about Varroa. But as I was told when I first got into beekeeping, you can do everything right and still lose your bees. And that's where these other side issues come in, like Curtis was talking about. You can do everything right and still have impacts on your bees that you don't have any control over. So it's a very complicated business, and that's why if somebody is planning to get into beekeeping, they really need to take and realize they have to take the time to learn what all these things that we're talking about if they expect to have success at keeping honeybee colonies alive.
Thank you, Fred.
Well, Curtis and Fred did a great job of explaining all the issues around Varroa, and I second Curtis's point about to mitigate the harm of some of these pests and pathogens that we're seeing. One of the things that we can definitely do is improve the availability of clean, pesticide-free habitat for both native and managed pollinators. So that means curbing the use of pesticides and making sure that there's clean forage available and habitat available for both of these managed and wild bees. For mites, Fred did a great job of giving the background around Varroa mites. A lot of education efforts going on, particularly with hobbyist new beekeepers, around how to monitor mite loads. So monitoring those mite loads all throughout the summer and then treating when needed. And turns out it's really hard to kill a bug on a bug. And so these Varroa mite treatments that are available, there's new ones that come out all the time. We see Varroa resistance to some of these treatments over time by Varroa, and it's just been sort of like an arms race to figure out the best and newest treatment or cultural method of trying to mitigate against these Varroa mites over time. And then the pesticide exposure piece is not helping it because we know pesticides reduce the immune response of pollinators to the viruses that are vectored by the Varroa mites. And so we can see that all these things sort of interplay with each other.
Thank you, Samantha. Brooke, did you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, just I have a lot I could add. So one fun thing I like to think about, I heard this on the radio the other day, that I think it was 50% of the species in the world are parasites. So Varroa mite is a parasite, and so if you look at it that way, it's a pretty fascinating parasite. How it interacts with the honeybee, and so you can hate or love the Varroa mite for all that it does and destroys and all that. But it was just a fun fact to think about biodiversity and the fact that I of course like to think about biodiversity and thinking that, oh yeah, parasites are actually part of biodiversity. And so it was a good brain thinking for me too. And also, and Samantha mentioned this too, that it's hard to kill a bug on a bug. Beekeepers use pesticides in their hives to manage the parasite. So it's a really complicated issue, but it is the #1 pest. So we have a report as part of the report that beekeepers fill out yearly, that the maladies that they see in their apiaries. It is the #1 reported malady that beekeepers see in their hives. So virtually there are Varroa mite in every colony in the state. Vermont beekeepers are supposed to have, it's written into statute that they're supposed to have a mite mitigation plan. So we take it pretty seriously. We do a lot of education. We hand out kits in order to help folks monitor, and I do a lot of teaching of monitoring mites to folks, especially new beekeepers. And they're pretty fascinated when they learn about how to see them, because you don't see them directly when you just look at the bee. You have to look closely and do a mite wash is the best method. So to getting people to understand that and really see them is one of those huge thresholds to get you on that learning curve of keeping healthier bees. And yeah, as far as Varroa is concerned, I forget the question. The mitigation efforts. Yeah, I mean, with the agency, yeah, we do a lot of education and outreach, and again, just work with folks to try to come up with plans and point them in the right direction, keep people up to date on the latest methods and new formulas that might be coming out. I just got an email today that the EPA has a comment period on a new Varroa side that might be coming out. But what is, as back to connecting it to pesticides, most of the, a lot of the, we've done some pesticide sampling in the state, and often what does come back are the pesticides that are in their honeybee hive pesticides. So I think we need to be careful when we use that term, because it is a huge term that it means a lot of things. So we need to be careful when we talk about those they may be harming the bees. I mean, they may be helping the bees too, is in the case of varroicides.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah. So I mentioned that we had tracheal mite, and Brooke does have a good point. Like, beekeepers do use pesticides in their hive. There's also, non-chemical interventions, and like Varroa mites feed on the brood of bees. So if you take a queen out from the equation, she stops laying for a while, and there's a break in the brood cycle. So there are both cultural and chemical methods to dealing with this issue. And she's right. Like, I have a binder, and every winter I make a new binder for the year of like what the plan is going to be and how many tests are we going to have to do. And one thing I will say is that my great-grandfather and my grandfather never had to do that. They went out there, and it was like 2-3 months of work out of the year. And the rest of it was selling honey and building equipment to expand their business. And just the times have drastically changed. And the pesticide that I'm particularly talking about is called neonicotinoids, and it's a class of insecticides. And they're used, prophylactically on seed coatings. And so it's like there's the old saying, like, do you give someone a fish, or you teach them how to fish so they can eat fish for their life, right? It's like, do you try to solve the Varroa for the bee, or do you take away the chemicals so that the bee can solve the Varroa for the bee? It's like, here we are just over intervening because we introduced these agrochemicals, specifically neonicotinoids, to our landscape. These bees are really suffering in their ability to evolve out of this problem. Like I said, we overcame tracheal mite, and what's on the horizon is even scarier than Varroa mite. It's called the tropiapsis mite, or the tropy mite for short, and it should be in the US in a matter of years. Hopefully we can prevent it and keep it off for as long as possible. But if we don't take action to remove the restraints to help the bees evolve out of these issues themselves, all we're doing is enabling them to continue this plight and endless cycle of death of the bees. And we've really got to change that, like yesterday. The EU, Quebec, even New York have banned neonicotinoids. And I think that it's time that Vermont does the same for the birds as well as the bees, and the humans too. Like, it's in the water, it's everywhere.
I appreciate your passion with the answer there, Curtis. It's wonderful to hear that New York did go ahead and ban that pesticide. That is something that we have been following closely in our research following up to this topic. And I know Allison has a lot of interest in this specifically, and it said that hopefully that passes, because Vermont is going to try to springboard off of that decision there. So hopefully we can see that happen. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and combine our last two questions because they're pretty similar. I would love to get us into the Q&A. So how can beekeepers better support native bee species, and why is it important to protect native bees along with honeybees?
I'll defer because I just took a double turn.
I'm going to defer a little bit here. I want to defer to Samantha because what's going on in the state of Vermont, there's a thing called a pollinator working group, and I want everybody to know what that pollinator working group is. And we don't want to, I think she needs to have the time to talk about that, because that is probably the single, other than educating new beekeepers on how to keep their colonies alive mechanically and physiologically through the year. What that pollinator working group is focused on is kind of like what Curtis is talking about here, where we're headed in the future. That the issue with pesticides in general is that the use is accelerating, not leveling off or decelerating, and it's 2023. And the view is, how long can we keep dumping poisons into our environment? That's kind of where we come from. And Samantha is, it became apparent, and back in just after 2019, when the last Pollinator Act that created Brooks' position, in fact, was passed, that this was something that the Vermont Beekeepers Association wasn't going to be able to contend with all by itself. It really has to be a much broader coalition of interested groups and the public to sound the alarm and say something's got to be done here. So I really want Samantha to talk about the pollinator working group. But just to clarify too, beekeepers do use products in their hives to control varroa, but there are different kinds of products. There are the synthetic things like the neonicotinoids that are chemically produced, and then there are the organic products that are like oxalic acid and formic acid and things like that that are actually in foods that we eat, in spinach and rhubarb and other foods that we eat. That aren't synthetic pesticides, the synthetic petrochemical pesticides, like some of the things that Curtis is talking about. There are still some of those, but many of us are now focusing on the organic side and the mechanical side that Curtis was talking about to control varroa. And with that, I'm not going to say any more because I really think that pollinator working group, we need to know more about that.
Thanks, Fred. So I'm going to start with the question about why it's important to protect native bees along with honeybees, and then I'll get to the Vermont Pollinator Working Group. So honeybees are a managed livestock animal. They're really important for the pollination of our food crops, and beekeepers have been struggling, as you've heard from these two beekeepers today, have been struggling for decades to keep their bees alive. And it's no different here in Vermont. You talk to any Vermont beekeeper, they're going to tell you the same story, that the losses that they're experiencing, the colony losses that they're experiencing, are not sustainable. And the reason why we're still seeing, record number of bees or the same number of bees every year is because beekeepers are really good at making more bees through splits. This is one reason why beekeepers can lose half their bees one year, but the overall number of hives can potentially stay the same. But this, of course, comes at a great loss to the beekeepers' profits, to the profitability of the industry, and it's incredibly laborious and expensive. So in general, we're not in danger of losing honeybees thanks to the incredible hard work and tenacity of the beekeepers. However, native bees do not have stewards called honeybees who can help them make splits and physically replicate their populations when they decrease. When we lose native bee species, that's it, they're gone. And native pollinators are critical for the reproduction of our native plants, and in many cases, they're much better pollinators of our food crops compared to honeybees. So that's why it's important to think about really trying to place in your brain why it's important when we're losing honeybees. It's a big problem for the industry, and why it's also important to protect the native bees. So we see in a new report from Vermont Center for Eco Studies, 55 of the 350 species or so of native bees are in urgent need of conservation action. We've been seeing year after year beekeepers losing 30, 40, 50, 60, sometimes 70% of their hives on average. And I'm citing some numbers from Bee Informed Partnerships colony survey loss. And so with all of this in mind, we can see that the pollinators are in trouble. And there's a number of different groups working on this from various angles. And this became apparent that maybe these groups should probably start working together and coordinating efforts rather than working in a silo. And so I worked with two other people, someone from Vermont Center for Eco Studies and someone from UVM Extension, to get a grant for this Vermont Pollinator Working Group. And it was funded by the UVM Gund. And they funded us to launch with two initiatives, one of which is this Know Your Five, which is a native bee education and awareness campaign around the top 5 pollinators pollinating food crops. And then the other piece is an initiative that's a a research and education and campaign targeting Vermont's policies on neonicotinoid pesticides. And my role in that group is to convene partners and to head up a pesticide monitoring project that we've been running since 2021. And so there's lots of, Audubon is a participant in this group, and the VBA as well, Conservation Law Foundation. I'm going to miss so many of them if I start listing them off. But there's lots of organizations that are all interested in these initiatives and working together to try to make the world of Vermont a better place for the pollinators, because they are in trouble.
So I was just typing up something because I didn't know we'd get to this question. But so the reason it's important to protect native bees along with honeybees is I'm thinking like ecologically that honeybees are generalist pollinators. So they'll basically, if it's over 50 degrees and not rainy, they'll be out flying. And so they'll basically go after any nectar source that they see fit, and so start gathering pollen. But the native bees have many of them are very specific. They've evolved specifically for certain flowers that bloom only a certain period of the time, and many of our native pollinators actually live most of their lives underground, and so they're nesting most of the time, going through their different phases, and then emerge and fly maybe for 2 weeks, and maybe only pollinate certain things that are blooming during a certain time, and then mate, and then start the process again underground. So again, that's where honeybees can become the gateway insect to learn about. And once you start learning about the life cycle of other bees, it's pretty fascinating. And along with that, bumblebees, we see a lot pollinating apple trees in the spring. And if it's a cool, kind of misty spring day that we often have here during apple bloom, you will primarily see bumblebees out. They are a lot more productive than honeybees, who are actually kind of lazy. So it's fun to observe that. And so, it's important ecologically to maintain biodiversity in the state, flowers and insects. And also, I think it's important to have honeybees as livestock and as a hobby for, citizens.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much for answering our questions today. I'm going to pass it over to Allison now for our Q&A portion.
Hi guys, thank you so much for all of that. I think we actually only have one question from the chat right now, which I guess is maybe okay since we've already taken more of your time than we said we would. But we appreciate you guys sticking around through the technical difficulties. But the question we got was, can you touch on the correlation between promoting pollinator health and mitigating the effects of climate change?
Simple question for a closure.
Keeping it light.
Well, with the world warming, bumblebees in particular have been harmed the most. We see that their ranges are shrinking. Bumblebees tend to like the northern climates and colder areas. And as things are warming, they're not moving north. They're actually just, their range is shrinking. And I think they've lost like 200 miles of latitude, I saw recently in a paper around the world. So climate change, it's affecting pollinators. I'm not sure how to answer the question about the correlation of promoting pollinator health and mitigating the effects of climate change, but that's one example of how climate change is affecting bumblebees.
I can add to that too. I can't correlate how pollinator health and climate change interact necessarily, but I do know that I'm in a commercial business as well, that Curtis is, and I rely on my colonies making it through the season. You're doing well through the season where they're able to forage and collect food. and then make it through the winter. And the weather is, beekeeping is one of the most highly weather dependent agricultural endeavors that you can participate in. It is even more weather dependent than growing crops. They're extremely sensitive to dry periods. When the weather is dry, the forage dries up. They don't have honey, and then there are complications with we're having to feed. But and I monitor the weather because they're so weather dependent. The colonies, beekeeping is such a weather dependent endeavor. I monitor the weather often, and there's a distinct difference from year to year. The thing that concerns me the most, I don't know what overall climate change is going to do to honeybee colony health over a long period of time, but I can say that my concern is that we're starting to see pests that used to be isolated in the southern tier of states in this country now moving north and surviving the winter here in Vermont. Things like small hive beetles are now showing up in Vermont, and we never had to contend with those before. And that's definitely a climate-related thing. Like ticks and chiggers, we never used to see those when we were, at least when some of us were young. We do see them all the time now, and the small hive beetles are now starting, and that affects colony health. It's another complication to keeping honeybee health colonies healthy. So there are some immediate things that are definitely climate related. As Samantha noted, weather has definitely warmed. Everybody can see that is a fact. And so it's leading toward the introduction of new pests and what it does to overall weather patterns and forage availability, which is a primary concern for those of us who are raising honeybee colonies. Can't really answer that yet, but it is changing, and we as beekeepers really have to adapt to whatever immediate weather is resulting from that climate change. We have to adapt to keep our colonies alive and healthy.
And I'll chime in too. So we recently just heard on the radio too that we are in a new, the growing zones for Vermont have changed. So that means our landscape has changed, and the plants can survive now in Vermont that haven't before. So that could be, invasive species to other plants that, it requires certain criteria to survive. So, and along with that is this, it's called phenological mismatch that happens, that honeybees, or not honeybees, sorry, just bees, native bees and native flowers have evolved together. And we've probably seen this where we have a warm spring and the flowers start blooming. I actually had someone send me a picture of apple trees blooming this fall because of that weird weather we had. So flowers are blooming, and those species that generally come out at the time when, that same, their mate flower is blooming, it's missed. So that creates a really poor opportunity for that bee species to continue its reproductive cycle. And so that can be really, really just like harmful for health of all bees, really. But I think, I like to kind of try to wrap up on an maybe positive note, hopefully, is that really a lot of the solution to health of native and honeybees, like Fred was saying, they need flowers to live. That's their habitat. That's their food source for the pollen and flowers. And so having a diverse pollen landscape that is not sprayed by any pesticide, that's clean, it can promote a lot of health within the environment for, and birds eat bees. So, it feeds all the, it goes up the chain from there. We can start, feeding all the critters that rely on bees to eat, but also then the plants that like turkeys and bears and things eat. So it's just an ecological bonus to have a more diverse landscape, and planting native flowers ranging throughout the season, early and late, so covering that ground of really productive flowers. It's plant flowers. That's the answer, kind of.
I also am really optimistic. I spend a lot of time sitting in on webinars and seminars throughout the year, listening to some of the cutting edge researchers in various parts both in the United States and also internationally. And it's very encouraging to see the kinds of things that researchers are looking at now to help with honeybee health issues. You know, I don't know how soon all of this is going to come, but the investment that's being made in pollinator research has started to pay off. We're starting to learn some things that we didn't know 10 years ago. And I think that will continue to grow because there are some very technically oriented solutions, not technically oriented, but practically and technically oriented solutions that aren't even on the table right now to some of the issues that face us regarding pollinator health. So to the extent that we can promote and encourage that research, I think it benefits us all in the end.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone said so far. I think that, you know, in large part that the correlation is less about mitigating the effects of climate change and more about mitigating the inputs that go into climate change. And once we start mitigating those inputs, I think we see, you know, that pollinator health rebound. And, you know, one example of this is our industrial agricultural system. It's just, you know, all built on monocrops and single crop plots. And we need to build more regenerative agricultural systems that have a diversity of flora and fauna, you know, for the bees and the other creatures to feed on. And yeah, the distance that our food travels. I mean, the smog that's created. There was a study I recently read that said the air quality index is, you know, correlated with the time that bees have to spend in flowers foraging. And it's estimated that they spend 70% more time in bad AQI. So when it's like when we had all the wildfires this summer, and that's bad because they produce less honey, but also because they're in the flowers where the toxins and pesticides are for longer, and that they could be bringing it back to the hive. So yeah, I think that we need to invest in like local systems and sustainable agriculture, and in turn, we're gonna see the benefits of the birds and the bees.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for bringing your expertise to us tonight. And thank you to all the attendees who stuck with us through the technical issues. And keep an eye out for an email from us. We're going to send a link to the YouTube recording of this. So if you know anyone who wanted to come but thought that we weren't going to make it, you can send or they can watch it still from that YouTube link. And then we're also going to send more resources so you can learn more about these topics, as well as ways to donate to our panelists, either to them or to their organizations, or where they would like the donations to go. So anyways, have a good night, and thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Bye.
having us.
Thank you.